May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I have a strange reaction to salt. Every time I taste salt in strong doses, or smell something salty in the air, or even when I just think about salt, I will cough. Salt makes me cough. Sometimes I'll be eating French fries and I can't get through them until my coughing fit stops. I can walk by a restaurant with the salty, vinegary smell of something deep fried, and I'll start to cough. I don't know what it is. I like salt if it's a given part of the recipe, but I would never ever think to myself that my plate of food needs more salt and start sprinkling it all over the dish. I'm usually astounded, aghast, I'm stunned when I see people grab the salt shaker and just dump it all over their food thoughtlessly, almost like an automatic reflex, wondering to myself, how can they eat that without coughing? Now, I've never met anyone else who has this affliction, except for an elderly woman I visited once in the Carberry Hospital. She told me that she didn't like the hospital food because they put salt in it, and she never used salt at home. It made her cough, she said. And I immediately perked up. For one thing, imagine hospital food being too salty. For another, here was a kindred spirit. I commiserated with her in awe that I was not the only person in the world who felt the same way. There were at least two of us. And as I said at the start, even just thinking about salt can make me cough. This is what makes me think it's a psychological thing. It's simply something in my head. And my kids have noted this idiosyncrasy and have taken advantage of my weakness. One of their favorite pastimes at supper growing up was to yell out the word salt. Salt, 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 nonstop, until I coughed. And they always won. So what does Jesus mean when he says that you are salt of the earth? I have to admit that when I've preached on this passage in the past, I've usually skipped over the salt and have gone directly to the light. You are the light of the world. Light is easy to talk about. I could talk about light until the cows come home and, and never have to suppress one single cough. But salt is a different story. I don't think I've ever preached about salt until today. But I suppose salt shouldn't really be overlooked. I recently discovered that the celebrated Chilean poet Pablo Neruda wrote an entire poem about salt, and he called it Ode to Salt. An ode, you might remember, is just a poem about an ordinary thing in an exalted, lofty, grand style. You may have heard of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale or his Ode on a Grecian Urn, two classics that you may have studied way, way back in school. One poem addressing a bird, the other poem addressing an old ceramic pot. Well, Pablo Neruda also wrote poems. One of them, I think, was called Ode to My Socks, believe it or not. But more to our point today, one of them was called Ode to Salt. He says that salt sings, and he calls salt the crystal of the seas. When we sprinkle salt on our food, he says, It's like sprinkling ocean's vital light. And when we taste it, it kisses our tongue. And so every grain of salt contains the whole sea. So that by the end of the poem, he says, and I quote, "The smallest miniature wave from the salt cellar reveals to us more than domestic whiteness. In it, we taste infinity." The smallest grain of salt, one invisible to the eye, brings to us the flavor of the infinite. In it, we taste infinity. The poet has high praise for salt. Strange as it may seem, he speaks directly to the salt with a voice of respect, for he's had an epiphany. That fine white grain contains within it the inward flavor of the infinite. Are we surprised then that someone else also speaks of salt and sings its praises? We heard today from the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus draws his disciples together to teach them about what God values and what God expects and what God desires for our lives and for the world. And he announces to those disciples, to them and to us, that you are salt of the earth. It's a strange thing for anyone to say, but maybe not so strange if we can come to it with poetic minds. Each of you, he's saying, is a paradox. We are so tiny, like a grain of salt. Yet infinity can shine forth through each of us. Now, we're probably just as surprised at this as were the original disciples. What do you mean we're salt? What do you mean infinity? The grain of salt is easy to miss. It's inconsequential. It's so ordinary. We don't give it a second thought, sprinkling it mindlessly on our food. None of us, I'm sure, woke up this morning and said, life is like a grain of salt. Life is much more like a box of chocolates, as all of you know. How mysterious for Jesus to tell us that insignificant salt can shine forth with the whole purpose of God. And then to tell us that you are the salt. Granted, most of us don't feel like this most of the time. But sometimes in our lives, sometimes in our week, sometimes in our day, we are called in this direction. And we must be mindful of Jesus' words, ready to offer the right response, ready to serve as salt that has not lost its flavor. I want to tell you a story of what I mean by telling you a story from our ancient history. It's a story the church has not forgotten precisely because it recounts a time when a single action sparkled with the flavor of the infinite. So, in the 4th century, a young man named Martin was serving in the Roman army in the city of Amiens, in what is now known as France. On a bitterly cold winter night, he came across a beggar pleading for help near the city gate. All of the other passers-by ignored him, but Martin saw him, and Martin wanted to help. The trouble was that he didn't know what to do. He had no money, he had no food, he had no shelter to offer the beggar. So he took off his big, warm army cloak And he used his sword to cut it in two, and he gave one part to the beggar, and he kept the other part for himself. Later that night, Martin had a dream, a big dream, one of those dreams that most people never have, one of which legends are made. Jesus appeared in Martin's dreams, along with several angels. The angels asked Jesus where he got the cloak that he was wearing, the half cloak that was wrapped around his shoulders. And Jesus replied that Martin gave it to him. That young soldier had responded to the beggar in exactly the way Jesus instructed him in the gospel. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. And when you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. At the time of this dream, Martin was in the long and demanding process of getting ready for baptism. It was a process that could take several years. He was what was known as a catechumen. Eventually, he would become baptized, and later he would become a monk, and he is credited with founding the first monastery in France. And by the time Martin had become a bishop, any church that is called St. Martin's today is named after him. But out of all of those amazing accomplishments in Martin's life, what is most securely lodged in the collective memory of the church is how he helped somebody in desperate need by splitting his own cloak in half. It's a story that's preserved to this day because it so clearly shows Martin's discipleship, even though at this point he was still awaiting baptism. We have in this story the inward flavor of the infinite, a saltiness that flavors the pot, a witness to the power of a single godly action, a tiny grain of salt. Talking to salt is a strange thing. Pablo Neruda did it in one of his odes. Jesus did it in the Sermon on the Mount. Martin heard himself addressed as salt in the pleading of that helpless beggar. And God still talks to salt when we pray and find ourselves spoken to. I know God spoke to someone and suggested that they start a grief support group. And that group became salt, flavor for those who needed it. I know God spoke to a woman in a year-long Bible course at some church who began to feel a compelling invitation to go deeper and to study further, who would say that her studies of the Bible were like salt in her regular routines, who began to see herself in ministry, and who only 2 weeks ago was finally ordained as a deacon. I know God spoke to someone who suggested it was time to stop the lying and the insanity and the chaos of their drinking and to pursue sobriety and to join AA. And for the last 30 years, by the grace of God, they have helped countless others go through the same journey. And he has been a small grain of salt that has changed lives forever. I know God spoke to someone at work who decided to make those complicated paper stars, those 3D Moravian stars, if you know what I mean, as a Christmas gift for all of the staff members, handing them out as a simple sign of her faith. And on that day, she was like a grain of salt flavoring the workplace. I know God spoke to a friend of mine who is a dentist, who decided one day to volunteer at a dental clinic in Central America to help those who otherwise wouldn't have any access to dental care. A little bit of salt flavoring so many lives. Perhaps you know what it is like to be addressed as salt. Invisible grains that reveal something of the inward flavor of the infinite. Perhaps you will be addressed as salt in the days ahead. For certainly our world stands in need of that flavor that comes through the salt of discipleship. Whatever the circumstances, when you are summoned, do not close your heart. Listen and consider. The world waits for what only you can provide. Thanks be to God. Amen.